So as we begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am joining you today from the unceded lands of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respects to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any First Nations peoples joining us today. And obviously this is an online seminar and also one of our first international online seminars. And so we have people joining us from throughout Australia and New Zealand and beyond. And so I invite you all to add your own acknowledgements of country to the Zoom chat. So welcome to this seminar in the Skills for New Historians series. If you haven't been to one of these seminars before, it's a series run by the Australian Historical Association through its early career representatives, essentially with the aim of shedding light on the myriad different things that go into being a historian in Australia or New Zealand. So usually these seminars are limited to AHA members, but we've been able to open this one up to everyone. So while we naturally highly recommend joining the AHA, and if there's time at the end, we can extemporize on the many, many benefits of doing so. The idea was that this will be a seminar that is useful to anyone who is doing a PhD in history, has done a PhD in history, or is even just thinking about doing one, which I know a couple of people in their RSVPs put as well. We're planning to run this as a bit of a roundtable discussion with hopefully a lot of participation from everyone in the room. So there's not going to be any formal presentations as such. So do please feel free to use the raise hand function as we go on, or to put questions in the chat, and it's going to be quite an informal chat. The topic for this seminar is obviously navigating the transition from postgrad to ECR. The end of the PhD is a profoundly dislocating process, an abrupt, often anticlimactic end to something that you've devoted 3 or more years of your life to. It can entail moving cities, states, or countries, starting new jobs, or piecing together bits of work, and trying to work out who you are and who you want to be as a historian. A challenging process that we all go through, which is why I think it is really important to discuss this openly. With that said, before we get started properly, I want to mention that this is a potentially challenging topic. Many people do have painful or negative experiences of this transition period of their careers, and many people still have quite raw feelings about this stage of their career. We want this to be a safe space to discuss the challenges of this aspect of academic life, but along with that, we need to emphasize that it's not a space for airing grievances. If you do want to discuss particular negative experiences, by all means do so, but please don't mention any individuals or institutions, even obliquely. Normally for one of these seminars, we would then have quite a lengthy formal introduction to our speakers, but because we are really envisaging this as a seminar to listen to and celebrate the stories of historians who have been through or going through this transition period, we thought we'd skip the formal introductions and just briefly mention some of the people you will be hearing from this afternoon, and then start by posing a few questions to get discussion going. So hello, my name is Rowan Howard. I am lecturer at Monash University and one of the ECR reps. You'll also be hearing from my fellow ECR rep, Ebony Nielsen, very shortly. We have both of our postgraduate AHA representatives as well, Ruby Eckel and Simon Farley, who are waving. The screen is slightly boggled, sorry. So I'm looking all over the place. We're also going to be joined by our superstar guest speakers, Justine Greenwood from DFAT and Kate Stevens from the University of Waikato. And I've also asked a few other ECR friends whose experiences I thought would add to the discussion as well. So shout out to Amy Way from Griffith University, and somewhere on here is Nick as well, who is joining me from the room next door at Monash, Nick Ferns. So I'm going to hand over to Ebony to kind of just kick us off with a question.
Absolutely. Thank you, Rowan. And thanks everyone for turning up. We're really quite stoked with the attendance on this one. That's very gratifying for us in organising these. Okay, I guess I'm addressing these, or we are addressing these primarily to Justine and Kate, but as Rowan said, we're envisaging this as a discussion. So if you'd like to add something, absolutely feel free. We've looking for a diversity of experience here because there isn't one transitional experience in heading into being an ECR. Justine and Kate, could you just give us a little outline of your journey from PhD to present? So where are you now? Where did you come from? Where did you find yourself on completing your PhD? Which bits did you have to block out because they were a little bit traumatic? Oh, Justine, do you want to jump in first?
Okay, I'm like, I'll unmute myself. Okay, yes. Yes, I was joking about this beforehand, that this is the one thing we were given the questions beforehand that I did actually have to make some notes about, because one, it's been a little while for me, and two, yeah, I blocked out quite a bit of this, and I'm just sort of rubbish with timelines for historian as well, like of my own life. So, you know, I could talk about, I don't know, the transition from white Australia to multicultural Australia or something, but I can't remember what happened 2 years ago. So if I'm looking, it's because I'm trying to remember, you know, what I wrote down here. But let's start with, so where I am now. As Ebony said, I'm in the historical publication section in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, which is definitely not where I thought I'd be when I finished my PhD at the end of 2016, in a large part because I didn't know there was such a job. So I'm happy to talk about that later if people are interested, and also happy to sort of talk a little bit about what the role entails, because it is different from your average kind of academic historian in some ways, but I'm happy to come back to that a little bit later. So that's where I am now. Where am I? Where did I start from? So I studied at the University of Sydney. The focus of my research was not on foreign relations. It wasn't on foreign policy, although I've sort of found that I can kind of, it was on the periphery of it in ways that I didn't quite realize. My work was on post-World War II immigration, the way that intersected with the rise of international tourism. And what I sort of found was that I was able to argue when I went for my current role that those two aspects were and sort of are relevant for how Australia had portrayed itself internationally. But that did involve sort of rethinking, I guess, what I'd done in my PhD work and what I'd done in the years preceding as well. So on completing the PhD then, I had been working as a course coordinator in my final year of the PhD. I missed out on that turning into a full-time position. By missed out, I mean something that happens to a lot of sessionals, in that I was teaching in that role. I was doing it reasonably well, but when it was converted to a full-time position, I just didn't have the runs on the board to apply for that. And so that role ended for me. I was lucky enough through that, and I'm going to use the word luck a lot in this because I think it just plays into it for all of us, really. I was lucky enough to have another course coordinator role lined up at the University of Newcastle, was where I first met, I was realizing, Ebony as an honours student all those many years ago. And then for me, those kind of quite long sessional years in the wilderness began. And this is where it all gets like too long. I've repressed, I can't even remember the details, but I was on that sort of teaching treadmill cycle for quite some time. I think at one stage I was teaching simultaneously at Newcastle, Wollongong and NYU Sydney, and sort of doing the commute back and forth in 1 week. Again, luck sort of came in. I was able to land a role, a sort of 2-day-a-week role with a really great research team working on Russian migration to Australia as a research associate, which allowed me to kind of very, very slowly and sporadically to keep kind of publishing as well. I think about, again, you know, a year after sort of finishing the PhD, I found my way into relatively stable sessional academic work. So I had a teaching gig that was sort of ongoing at NYU. I mean, the contract would end, but then they tend to renew it. So that was pretty good. And I had that research associate work. But then COVID hit. And so that changed that relatively stable sort of 4 years of work. So the international students from NYU, the US students went home. The ARC project was wrapping up. And so at that point, I was left with very few options within academia. A lot of people found themselves, I think, in that position at that time. And so it was a reluctant transition for me. And again, something I'm happy to speak about, but I did sort of quite reluctantly transition into a professional role at a university within UNSW at that point. I was in that role for almost 2 years when the opportunity, we're almost getting to the end of the story, at DFAT came along. And now I've been in Canberra for almost 1 year. At the end of this week, it'll be a year. So that's kind of the condensed story, but more than happy to talk about specific points if there's interest, basically. I'll wrap that for now.
Thank you, Justine. I think you actually taught Rowan as an undergrad too at Sydney. So you
Did.
both of us very early on. Kate, would you like to jump in?
Yeah, sure. Kia ora, thanks so much for having us here, because I think it's really nice to actually, I'm not sure about the superstar or star speaker label, but definitely I really enjoy the opportunity to connect with everyone and talk about some of these issues that I think it's really important to discuss. And it's lovely to see some familiar names and faces here, as well as I sort of am starting to know more of the Australian academics in the AHA community. So yeah, I also wrote some notes for this because there's sort of this winding journey, and I think we often don't see that. So I did my undergrad at Otago, and I worked for a little bit, and then I did briefly actually at the New Zealand equivalent of DFAT, and then I did my PhD at Cambridge in the UK. And I sort of was in that kind of wilderness of trying to figure out submitting and Viva and so on at the end of 2014 and early 2015, at the same time as moving back to New Zealand because my visa was running out in the UK and I did not have a job or anything to sponsor me. So I was moving back, and I had been in that last year of the PhD. Actually, I should say I'm now at the University of Waikato and I'm a senior lecturer. So I'm in a permanent academic position, and it's kind of like this A and B, if you just look at them alone, look quite linear. But there's a lot of ups and downs in between, including like leaving academia and working in non-academic roles for a period. So yeah, I initially was applying, for all and everything in that final year of the thesis, as well as in the UK, mainly in the UK, a little bit in US or Europe. Wasn't really getting much success, partly because I hadn't got much teaching experience. The Cambridge system, and I think this can be true in some institutions in Australia and New Zealand, don't necessarily lend themselves to getting the necessary experience to be really competitive for a permanent job. I think I got longlisted for one thing. But what actually got me through was that I was also named as a part-time postdoctoral fellow for a Professor's Marsden grant at Otago. This is the university I've been at for my undergrad, and they were successful in getting this grant. Marsden is kind of our Blue Skies funding, our kind of ARC equivalent here in Aotearoa. And so that actually meant that I had a part-time postdoc position at Otago for this particular project. So this was my first kind of post-PhD thing. I had a few months of unemployment with sort of no income until that started. There was no sort of teaching in that time because it was summer. So I actually was I think at that point, on the dole in New Zealand, essentially, because there weren't many jobs that just wanted you in January and February. So and then I moved to Dunedin for this position, and I was working, and I did some short-term lecturing contracts to kind of make up some of those hours, and I was trying to do some publications for my PhD. So had this kind of opportunity, which was really, really wonderful, because I think otherwise I would have been potentially leaving straight after the PhD. I was sort of thinking, what else might there be at that point in time? But also during that time as a postdoc, all the permanent staff where I was working, and I am talking about this specifically, it is public, it was in the news a lot at the time, had to reapply for their jobs as part of cuts in the humanities. And I think that was really, this kind of underlined that so much is precarious. Like even if you've got a permanent job, it can still be quite precarious in academia these days. And I think that was I bring it up because I think it was a really sort of foundational experience to my kind of slight ambivalence to academia and the structures there. And I'm sure for those that have been around other institutions that have been through similar restructures and the stress and the culture that kind of brings with it, may have some thoughts and experiences on that. And what it meant is that when my contract was, 6 months from being up, I was like, well, or, a year from being up, 6 months, I was like, well, what am I going to do? At that point, there was zero teaching work the following year. So it was kind of like, well, there's definitely no contract. I was partway through a grant application for my own grant. But, I had a 40% chance of success at that point. But if I wasn't successful, I was going to be unemployed. So I was also applying for non-academic things. And I got offered a job at the research funding team at the Royal Society Te Aparangi, which is our, funding management agency. And that was a really hard moment because I was like, well, I've got the security and a sort of research adjacent job, but not in academia. And I, at that point, took that security. It did mean withdrawing from the grant application because that was the organization that managed the grant process. So it was quite a tough kind of weighing up of what I was going to do. But I thought at that point I was, quite ambivalent about the system. I was there for 2 years. It's a great place to work. It was very collegial, very interesting colleagues, but also I was getting extremely bored with the work. And so I was still trying to do a bit of publishing, finishing things off, thinking about if I'm out of academia, what is it that I want out there? And also applying for a couple of jobs that came up, but only that were in permanent jobs and only that were in New Zealand Pacific, places where I thought I might work. And that's actually how I ended up at Waikato, which I started shortly before the pandemic. So a lot of my experience here has been a pandemic and a lockdown one. So in those sort of longer lockdowns with Auckland up where we are. And I think one of the big points that I bolded in my notes that I also wrote for this question for similar reasons to Justine was there's a lot of luck, like the timing of all this happening made it possible. Like I was able to move back into academia partly because there's that pipeline. Like I had a sort of fresh CV research wise because there were still things coming out that I've been working on during the postdoc. And so my CV still looked quite like I was quite active because there is that lag time with your publications. I think, even a year later, I don't know I would have been considered competitive. I don't know what I would have, stood out among the many applicants in that process. So I think it just, in my case, it happened to be, a lot of fortuitous timing that, led me to where I am today. And so I think that's a really important, point that comes across from both of our journeys thus far.
Yeah, that's what I was actually just going to highlight too, Kate. Thanks. That it's a tricky tension, that one, right? Because we all do work really hard, and by the time you get to this point, the pool is small. We're all very good, but there is this element of luck as well, and timing. I think is a really big part of it too. Yeah. So kind of on that track, it can be helpful, I think, to talk about the practical side of things. And you've already both started to touch on this a bit. If you're comfortable with it, are you happy to talk a bit about how you literally just make ends meet during that transition stage, how you pay the rent, and kind of relatedly, how did you find history adjacent work? So how did you find tutoring? How did you find RA work and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So compared to many others, I think my sessional work, I'm going to keep saying lucky, but it was lucky that it was relatively stable in that, as I said, NYU basically guarantee 2 semesters teaching. And then I sort of had that winter school, like their winter school, middle of the year kind of to fill. And I had an RA position for 2 days that it was on a sort of it was over 3 years as part of an ARC grant. So I sort of had those things. Now that wasn't quite enough to make ends meet, but there would be other opportunities that would usually come up every few months. So if it was a bit more RA work for something else, maybe some extra teaching in the middle of the year. What that did mean, though, was there was often no break. And I'm sure many of you have experienced this, no breaks from teaching. You finish one course, you start another. You often can't even remember what you're actually teaching sometimes because you're just doing so many. So that was one thing that kind of helped, that relative stability, that it did kind of keep ticking over, even at moments when I wasn't sure if it was going to, the next thing would sort of often come along. Another thing, this is sort of really veering, I guess, into the personal, but I think it mattered for me, was having a partner at the time who was also doing sessional work and study, but that combined income, I think, was quite essential. I don't think I could have quite managed it alone in the same way. And once that sort of ended, it was kind of clear that I was going to sort of struggle sort of financially. I mean, that was always on the cards, but also just not having someone else to share that kind of mental, emotional kind of load with as well. And then for me, COVID came along at that point. So it sort of, it compounded all those issues and made it really clear to me, as Kate was saying, at one point she had to make that choice and look for something more stable, more secure, that at that stage in my life, that was now the priority. It didn't matter if it was an academic job. What mattered was security and stability. So, you know, that's sort of how I managed in that period. And then I guess made the decision to transition out of it. In terms of how I found that work, I mean, a lot of you will know a lot of this works on networks, and it's not really fair. I mean, I think it shows how unfair this system is in a lot of ways. If you're from a bigger university that has more options to create those networks, more opportunities, that's often going to mean that you get those teaching roles. Being at Sydney, I think, opened those doors for me, having a supervisor who was very keen to place me in teaching roles and for me to get that experience, rather than a supervisor, say, who was more focused on, which can be good as well, just getting the PhD done. There are those two schools of thoughts. But for me, because I needed the work, I was, you know, able to, in that final year, I started tutoring halfway through. I was a course coordinator by the time I was finishing my, so those things kind of coincided for me. And then, as I said, word of mouth. So you sort of teach in one place, people get to know you and they say, oh, there's another job coming up the following semester. Why don't you contact such and such? But again, talking about this inherent unfairness, I didn't interview for any of those roles. I think it wasn't really until probably, well, yeah, the first non-professional role at UNSW, I mean, the professional role and academic role, I interviewed for that. All those sessional teaching roles were just sort of these casual kind of informal conversations where someone said, oh, you'd be good. Why don't you come along? And I got the role that way. So I think, again, highlighting that unfairness in a lot of ways, that almost nepotism really is something that I think we can be honest about in this forum.
And they can be, sorry, Kate, I'm just going to jump in, use my rep privileges. They can be kind of lateral relationships as well. So my very first course coordination role I got because Rowan was the one who put me up for it. So I totally agree. It can often it's supervisors, but I think those lateral networks can help as well in some instances. Yeah. Kate, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, just starting with that point that I think you've both raised, I mean, that postdoc, you know, that's actually not a lecturer that I was working with for the postdoc, was not actually someone who taught me directly as an undergrad, but was from that program. And so that kind of network where you are kind of known and visible, those are really helpful. Even though I'd been overseas, you know, far away and hadn't been back and didn't have any money to sort of visit particularly, had been something that helped me get there. I mean, I also did non-academic work. So I found some of the hardest bit was actually that immediate post-PhD, you know, submission. You just sort of submitted and you've got to wait for examination. You haven't actually finished. And, you know, but your funding's potentially run out, all of those things. That was a time where I ended up, well, firstly, there was hardship funding through my college, and
I think Kate's just frozen. That's not just me, is it? That's, yeah.
Okay.
We'll roll with it.
Roll with it. We can do we go to a different question maybe, and we'll come back to that? Or if anyone else wanted to jump in, feel free.
Yeah,
well.
I was just going to open up. Does anyone else want to jump in on how you kind of pay the rent?
Well, we have Kate re-entering the room.
I think there's a hand up there, Rowan. Rebecca?
Hi. I was just thinking, just kind of bouncing off their ideas of, you know, being available and talking to people within our departments. I've managed to pick up lots of small jobs. So even though I don't have a job that, you know, is fitting the entire thing, I'm working casually on a committee to kind of just do their minutes and agendas and making sure their archiving's up to date. Worked for a little bit in the library in the past and things like that. So as much as it's slightly messy, it allows you both to get massive amount of contacts in different kind of areas of the university, but also because universities tend to have quite a good award rates, you're not just networking, you're getting really, really good soft skills and you're paying the bills. So kind of don't necessarily look for one job that's going to, you know, pay the rent, but try and work out how you can fit several things together.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you. Kate, are you? Oh, there you are. You're back.
Yep, I'm back. Apologies. My work machine, they just replaced my other machine because it died with a new laptop that totally just died. So apologies, everyone. I was like, oh no. Luckily, I have my personal laptop with me. So no, I think just to, build on those points. Yeah, I actually worked in a non-academic thing. I worked under the table in Ireland for a friend's family for a bit, who allowed me to go and stay with them and things like that. So there were networks kind of outside of, maybe in this case, it wasn't a partner for me, but it was having those other networks that created opportunities. And I was, just doing some part-time work, staying with them for a period of time. And the other big thing that I wanted to emphasize was that the postdoc that I had, when it wasn't full-time, but the salary actually was, even with being part-time, was very livable because I was in a city that was really, really affordable. And these are the other things that make such a big difference. Had I been in a different city in New Zealand, and I, from what I know of Australia, this would also be true there, there's a massive discrepancy with the cost of living, the cost of rent. And I had flatmates, I did all of that. But, the biggest probably single difference there about being able to live on a much lower salary was the fact that my rent was so much lower than it might have been if I was in a different city. And I think these are kind of these hard things, we can't all be mobile or whatever, but in my case, that made a huge difference to what I could budget on and what I could live on as a salary.
Yeah, I spent many, many hours on the train for the same reason. So I could live in Newcastle while I was at Sydney. Yeah. Ruby, I'll just highlight, Ruby has very helpfully put a link in the chat to the postgrad database, which can be a really good way to pick up RA work if you're looking for that. Ames, did you have your hand up before? Did you want to add anything?
Oh, I was just going to jump in and say something quite similar to what Kate's last point just there, of that in terms of the academic adjacent or outside of academic work, and also like relying on the networks of not just academics or your superiors, but networks through your peers as well. One of the life-saving rent-paying gigs that I got in the first year out of my PhD was through a fellow HDR-ECR at that point, who everybody I think is probably familiar with, Jared Hoare, who's like another very prominent person in our AHA community. And it was through, some casual RA work that he had secured that he was then in conversation with someone else who was looking for more, like another RA. So it was this really like little chain of sort of Chinese whispers, of just people in the community. And it was a pure luck thing. He was in the lunchroom at the same time that somebody was having a conversation of like, oh, it'd be really good to get someone, the family is looking for a historian to do this small amount of RA work. Who do we know? And it was this really nice moment of sort of the public history sector coming together with the university sector, because they looked at him and said, oh, Jared, you're in university spaces. Do you know somebody? And he was like, yeah, I got a whole list of friends who are looking for work. So I would say, that networking and that being present at the sort of official level, in university spaces with your supervisors, with your superiors, is obviously really important. But so too is just maintaining your relationships with your peers and your colleagues and your friends, because even though it can sometimes feel like we're all drowning together, we're actually doing a lot more than that. And I've seen a lot of really beautiful support from people at our level of just like finding little things for friends, even if it's just a couple of days here and there, has certainly been my experience, which has been really positive.
That actually feeds really well into the next question that I did want to ask, which I had not shared the questions in advance, so this was not set up, but it almost perfectly was, which was about kind of acts of ECR kindness, because I was curious if you had any thoughts. And this is another one that I think can be opened up to the room, around what things helped or didn't help when you were going through these experiences of precarious employment, part-time employment, that difficult post-PhD period. What are the things that made a difference, whether it's the practical difference or things that are a bit more kind of emotional well-being wise. I know in my case, one of my PhD examiners essentially adopted me and kind of invited me into her writing groups and giving seminars, and kind of put me up for teaching work there. It was just kind of totally not expected or required, but just that kind of thing. And I'm sure everyone has similar kinds of stories. So I was curious if anyone wants to share a few of them here.
I'm happy to jump in. I wrote a few different things. I mean, the first one was that, yeah, this is a friend in a totally different field at my PhD, that her family had me to like basically live with them for like a month, or it might have been 5 or 6 weeks, I'm not sure. And, you know, do some work, cash in hand, like this, you know, it was kind of like an overseas family when I was there. And I, you know, for those that are international students, potentially, I don't know how many might be in this conversation, you know, those kind of networks where you have, you know, friends from your, you know, and cohort, but like their family kind of adopts you as well, has been like, that was really amazing, both, you know, during the PhD when I sometimes had been there for Christmas or whatever, but also, you know, post PhD, that was really amazing. And also, yeah, but like from those networks, I've had, you know, I've done some RA work, and, you know, it's not necessarily expected in this situation, but you know, that the professor included me as an author, you know, and so, you know, included me beyond, say, that paid work. And, you know, that's a kind of both mentoring in terms of learning about the publication process, whatever level that happens, even if that's pre-PhD potentially for some of us, but like the fact that she, you know, wasn't just like, okay, thanks for the hours and you're a line in the acknowledgement, was quite, I thought, quite amazing, but also helped me think about different ways, you know, that we, as we're coming through, potentially some of us, or supervising or thinking about these kind of relationships, that they might look differently, and we might be more collaborative and think about those relationships and the hierarchies and why we do things the way they do. So that was a really, I think, transformative thing for how I think about those kind of relationships as well.
Yeah, I'd just say something similar about the kind of reciprocity, the handing on, or the handing almost down of roles in some ways. So the ARC project I was involved in, the previous research associate managed to secure sort of an ongoing position, was able to step up to chief investigator, then brought me in and said, okay, well, now you can have this role as a research associate. Look, it's mainly project management. It's mainly just trying to keep everybody on track. But what we actually try and do is carve out a bit of time for you to write as well. We want you to publish where you can in this role, even though it's a little bit tricky because predominantly it was that administrative side of things. And just having someone who had been through that, was able to get publications out of it because of it, and knew how important that would be for me, was very, very helpful in that situation as well. And then I sort of had just lots of memories of just, you know, those informal kind of, those friendship networks that you sort of make along the way, where you just grabbing a coffee and ranting or commiserating or celebrating, as the case may be, because you've got that little extra bit of work. And just, you know, keeping those connections up. Sometimes it's a lot easier to do that in the PhD, obviously more dispersed once it's over, and people move on and people move out of academia, or whatever it is. So keeping up with both, you know, those people that you went through the PhD with that have stayed in academia, and those who have left it and found other things as well, it can be a real reality check, which I needed a lot. I needed to be reminded that there were sort of other pathways as well. And the other thing was, I didn't actively participate, but there were lots of online forums, blogs, you know, Twitter. I lurked quite a bit. I don't know why I didn't sort of leap in, but the lurking and sort of reading about other people's experiences, their grief, their successes, and all of that was often really, really helpful as well. There's some, I can't remember now exact names, but there's probably others who have come after, but really excellent blogs where people share really detailed experiences about this time and how they navigated it, and the emotional stuff and the things that helped them, and, you know, contacts and all sorts of things. There's really, you know, I'm sure both Rowan and Ebony and the HDR probably have those resources. So occasionally going back to those was quite helpful for me as well, and just reminding myself that there were a lot of others in the same situation.
Yeah, community kind of, sorry, Rowan, community keeps coming out as a common thread here, I think, which is surprisingly wholesome for a chat about something which is notoriously so difficult. I'm going to embarrass Rowan because he won't talk himself up, because he did a lot of that for me when I first got my first course coordination gig. Actually, Justine did too. You gave me a whole suite of your lectures. I got handed a course to coordinate 4 days before it began, because this is how casual teaching works sometimes. Justine gave me a whole suite of lectures. Rowan did too. He basically coached me through my first course coordination. So I think having people around you who are, you know, just a couple of steps ahead, one step ahead, and that bit of range can be really helpful. ECRs are just super generous, wonderful people. It's good. Sorry, Rowan.
And related note before I throw over to Amy as well, I was just thinking that one of the coolest emails I got as a very newly minted PhD was when someone emailed me to say they were using my article in their course. And so definitely do that. Use your friends' work and promote it in that way, but also tell them about it, because I think it's something that is very easy to put off and not tell people. But if they know about it, they can make something of that. Amy.
Yeah, I was just going to add to the, embarrass Rowan by telling everybody how great he is thing, because very similar experience. Rowan and I were postdocs together at the same institution at the same time. And so that was really nice. We just met regularly for coffee and talked through that experience. And also it was talking about what the next steps were. And we were kind of making plans together. We'd also talk through ideas. And so that kind of ongoing emotional support was really lovely. But then when it came to crunch time as well, with job interviews and applications and things like that, I think the most practical support I've ever been offered was from Rowan, in terms of I'd never done an interview for an academic job before. I'd applied for several, but I'd never been successful getting to the interview stage. And so Rowan shared a lot of his knowledge and experience from his interviews that he had done, kind of just even telling me what it would feel like to be in the room and what the structure of it would likely be like. And there's a document floating around that I know a lot of people who are here today have contributed to. It was this sort of, HDR-ECR Bible of the questions I got asked at my job interview thing. And it was this 2 or 3 pages of questions. So, then Rowan printed that off for me, and we sat at the cafe and went through, and he was like, these are the ones that I think you're most likely to get asked about, and you should have this kind of response prepared for it, and maybe this sort of thing. And I mean, it was just so useful and so helpful. And that was put together by 10 to 15 to 20 people, some of whom I knew, some of whom I'd never met before, but it was this collegial sharing of experience to help get through. And I got the job, and I think largely because of Rowan's prep and assistance. So talking to your friends about their reading over their resumes and their CVs, being somebody to practice questions with, citing their sources and telling them about it, telling everyone that about how great their work is, and putting them up for stuff. It's just all the little things that add up to make a more solid and secure working environment, I think. And it just made me feel very cared for and very loved. And when you feel cared for and loved in what can sometimes be a very toxic space, then you are a lot more capable of doing that for other people as well. So it's just feeding into helping everybody. So I just think it's such good practice if we can kind of, again, all hold our head above water together, I think. So thanks again, Rowan. Love ya.
This is getting incredibly awkward, so I'm going to throw to Nick, who will puncture all of that.
As much as I'd love to embarrass you further, Rod, I won't do so. But I do want to bounce off one of the points you brought up before, which was about your examiner or examiners. And I think maintaining and kind of using the relationship with your examiners is something that I managed to get a grant or a small little sort of bursary, I guess it was, through the AHA, which sort of involved one of my examiners being sort of a mentor, and it became one of my sort of, dare I say, most cited articles that sort of was partly, produced through this collaborative sort of process. And I think that conversations I had with my examiners, particularly in that first couple of years after submitting my PhD, were really important in giving me sort of research direction, if you will, because I think one thing that we haven't really talked about today is you finish a PhD and then there's like, what am I supposed to do now as a researcher? As, you know, you've got the book, like that's the thing that you get told to do, but that's sort of slightly a backwards looking process. You're converting something you've spent the last however many years doing. But I think, we weren't circulated those questions in advance. I literally just found out, I can see in the chat that that's the next question. But my examiners were really helpful with that because, of course, they were, aside from my supervisors, the most familiar people with what, you know, my research was and so on. But also, I think that the power of the sort of intangible elements, yes, there's assistance with RA work and so on, but some of the things that helped me get through the kind of, dare I say, what I might call the dark time of you know, post-PhD life was, you know, hanging out at a conference and having, dare I say, a few too many drinks with Ebony or something like that, you know, and sort of sharing the experience so you're not just alone in this sort of isolating kind of experience. But also that sort of point you made, Rowan, about the little sort of intent, the kind of being told your article is being used as a reading, they do help spur you on where you might be like, oh, I don't want to apply for sessional teaching again. I've had enough. I'm fed up. That you sort of manage to sort of, yeah, keep tracking with these sorts of things. So I think, yeah, just to bounce off everything, I think those points are really important. Yeah.
And I like that you brought up examiners too, Nick, because that's, I think that's a really good one, and something that's easy to forget about is that that's another connection which is kind of already set up for you, right? It's very easy, or relatively easy, to then email that person after you've got your reports back and say, hey, thanks so much for that, appreciated your comments. And a piece of advice I got at that point, which I really appreciated, was ask them who they think you should be approaching to publish it as a book, because that can be a really helpful bit of input because they know the thesis quite well. So yeah, that's absolutely a really good senior network to work when you can. I like that. And this really does feel like we've set you guys up to lead into our next questions, but we really didn't. It's serendipitous. So one of the things that I think I struggled with the most when I came out of the PhD and started as a postdoc was during your PhD, when someone says, and what do you work on? You give your thesis topic, right? Once the thesis is done, I think I would go, oh, well, my thesis was about this, but it starts to not work anymore, right? So are any of you able to talk a bit about how you start to articulate your identity as a scholar, as a historian, what it is that you do when you get past the PhD? What things did you find helpful in figuring out how to articulate that?
I'll jump in again. Okay, I have to be honest, it took me a long time, and that's partly because I was really bad at answering that question during my PhD. Like, I hated being asked what I was doing. And I think it was partly because my work straddled two fields, and I never felt that I actually neatly sat in either of them. And that might be, you know, I think that can be a common experience as well. And so in a weird way, it became an advantage after I left, because I didn't have this sense of, oh, this is a project that's completed and now where do I go? Well, it was always a work in progress of trying to explain what it was I was doing, both to myself and others. I gradually became more comfortable with classifying myself as an immigration historian, just a very broad sort of term, because I continued to be involved in those areas of research through that ARC project or the Russian migrants project. I was teaching in that field. I, expanded my collegial network in that field. And as I said, so what I thought was maybe a sort of perceived as a disadvantage actually helped, because being quite vague and broad about what I did, rather than having something that was more niche, which can be excellent, I think, in its own way, if you really sort of know what you're doing in the field that you want to be in and everything. But it was quite vague and broad and sometimes amorphous for me, meant that I was quite flexible when it came to reworking the work that I had done, the work that I was currently doing, into multiple fields, as I say, eventually into something like foreign policy, and being like, oh, I can see how those two things, migration and foreign policy, have aligned over time. I can talk to that. And so I think what I'd say at this point is that, identity, your academic identity, will change, and probably in lots of ways should change over your career, because you'll become more interested in different topics, new opportunities will present themselves. And so I think it's okay. Well, for me, I found that it's okay that it's kind of an evolving thing.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't jump in immediately, partly because I was going to say similar. Like, I honestly still kind of struggle with this, particularly with this kind of path. You've done the PhD and then being a postdoc on a totally different project that wasn't necessarily a project I designed, that was quite different, and then also trying to get my own, you know, new projects sort of started, and all of these things meant I had, and partly then leaving academia and being much slower with actually getting anything published than I might otherwise have been, or maybe not, who knows. I'm still feeling it's quite slow with all the teaching and admin and stuff. But regardless, it feels like there's all of these different strands of quite disparate projects that are all in various stages of incompletion, let's say. And so being able to sort of say, yeah, I've got this is me. I actually have always found quite hard. And someone said basically told me this at drinks after a conference, like, you're a bit all over the place. What is it that you're actually doing? Who are you as a thing? And I was like, I didn't even realize it until that point, essentially, for this kind of slightly cutting question over drinks, that I actually might need to be able to articulate that. And so it was kind of almost one of those things that I hadn't realized, or maybe been told enough, that would be potentially, there might be some advantage to being better at articulating that than I was in my kind of waffly answer whenever I got asked. And I do think one of the things I would say is often like endlessly rewarding those silly little bios that we have to write for things. And I know they're helpful in some ways and they're whatever, but you know, you've got 50 words and you've got to say something, that I basically probably change, even if it's just one word, change it every time I submit. But I will certainly emphasize different things about what I've done and what my area is, depending on what I'm submitting to, because, you know, being strategic, you know, if it's something in, you know, Pacific history or colonial history, they'll be quite different. If it's something, you know, environmental that I'm working on and some of that stuff versus the kind of gender and legal history stuff, I'm going to like emphasize different things. And I think that's perhaps sometimes more important than just being able to summarize it neatly, is being able to know when to emphasize what elements of what you've done. Yeah. But yeah, I honestly got that one. I was like, I don't know. I still don't know. So maybe we're all still trying to figure that one out.
I probably should have phrased that in a slightly more open-ended way, because I should say that I feel like I'm still really bad at this too. It's definitely a process.
I just jump in there and say, I think, like, picking up on Kate's point, yeah, there's the not knowing, which I certainly feel. And then I think, you know, Cambridge and Rowan said, it's also useful to just, come up with that kind of canned answer that you can give, like the elevator pitch thing. It doesn't matter if you don't believe it. You just have to sound convincing to whoever's asking the question at the time. So yeah, you can have both of those things, I think, simultaneously. Just keep the angst inside, or for these kind of forums.
We're all about angst here. I love it.
I might lead straight into the next question. And this is one where I want Ebony and Amy to talk about this as well, because I know they have good relevant experiences, which is that, like, most people here have done Australian PhDs or are doing them. Obviously not everyone, but most. And I think an Australian PhD in particular, it trains you really well in how to do a single major research project, but it doesn't provide a whole lot of training in like the other aspects of being a historian, whether that's, you know, a teaching and research historian at a university, whether it's a research position, a teaching, you know, sessional teaching job, whether it's GLAM sector work, public history, whatever, you know, being a historian is. Your PhD doesn't tend to teach you, how do you actually design your own course? How do you supervise students? How do you build a research team? Or how do you work on someone else's project when you're not in control of it anymore? How do you review a curriculum, as I've discovered this year? No one ever taught me how to do that. How did you find kind of these processes of learning on the job? Because I think it's useful to think about all the things that you come out of the PhD not knowing, so people don't feel like they're behind in any sense, because so much of it is that process. So it's a very broad and open question, but if anyone would like to jump in on your experiences of learning all of the other aspects of historical life on the job.
Well, I might just jump in at the moment because I'm literally in the middle of this right now. So I started my academic position in January of this year, so I'm not even really 12 months in. And I found out I got the job in the June or July or whatever it was last year, but wasn't able to start until the January. And then I found out in September, October of last year that the teaching I would be required to do in the first trimester we do here was a course that hadn't been taught in several years because the previous convener had retired, but they wanted to bring it back, and there were no previous materials because this person had retired and they transitioned over to a whole new kind of online course platform thing and all this. And they were just like, yep, so we thought you'd be perfect at writing this and at doing this. And so there you go, you have this course. And as Rowan can attest, he was there to witness all of it. I just totally sent me into an anxiety spiral because I was utterly thrilled and excited at the prospect of designing my own course. I mean, I think it's those of us who enjoy the teaching aspect of being a historian dream of being able to do this at some point, but I had no intention to be doing it in my first 6 months of my first big girl academic job. And I was utterly terrified, not least because of some sort of various personal circumstances and things. I lost the summer, which I was planning to spend writing the lectures and doing the, steadily research on my own time just to make myself feel a bit calmer and a bit better about it. I suddenly lost all that prep time to illness and basically had to start planning the entire curriculum assessment and website about 4 weeks before I was supposed to teach it. Now, depending who you ask, that's a really large amount of time to prepare for a course. For somebody like me who had never done it before, I thought that this would be the death of me. There was no way I was going to do it. So yeah, I would say I did not feel prepared at all. And my colleagues were really lovely and were really supportive and offered to do anything and everything they possibly could to help me out. I think the way I got through that was to lean into that, to really just be honest about where I thought my skills were at and what my limitations were, and to speak to people I trusted for their advice. And, again, as per usual, the history community really delivered, and lots of people kind of gave me ideas or strategies that they had used in their own course development. Rowan, again, we sat and had dinner at one point late last year and kind of thrashed out almost all the content, like just thinking up ideas and thematic structures that I might be able to use and things like that. So, if you have friends who are ideas people and who can help you formulate your very scatterbrained kind of thoughts and feelings, I found that really helpful. But I wish I had something a little bit more concrete and more, to say, other than I kind of just had to do it and pull it out of my ass a little bit. And the strategies that I used to do that were the same strategies that I'd used in the, job application and interview process, in the, it's the thesis writing groups, it's your peer mentors, it's your senior mentors, all that kind of stuff. I used the same support networks and the same strategies in the course development, and saw things that I liked, asked people how they did them, tried to implement it in my own way, and just had to give it a go. And I think it worked relatively well. I'm now in a similar position for another new course next year, so I'll be able to test and see whether what I've learned from this experience can be refined somewhat to do it again. But yeah, it's very challenging, but doable. And, I'm here, I've survived. And it's certainly not as much hard work as other people have done. I think at least Ebony has had similar experiences. So yeah, can be done. Ask your friends, ask for help, and just be honest about where you're at. And people are surprisingly, or not so surprisingly, I think, for the Australian history community, but are very good at supporting you and offering you advice and direction.
Yeah, I'd second that, Amy. Yeah, and I think that the knowledge that everyone else is flying by the seat of their pants as well, like everyone is just figuring this out as they go, particularly when you finish the PhD in Australia. I think that is kind of helpful, right? Because you go, okay, well, the bar is maybe not quite so high as I set it for myself, and I just have to get through this and it'll be fine. I think one of the things I found the hardest the first time I coordinated was reading lists. So I actually have a teaching degree. I started in high school, so the actual teaching part of it I was okay with, but figuring out how to do a reading list I found really challenging. And we keep saying it, but I went to Rowan. Maybe that's today's takeaway. But even today, like I coordinated another course this semester for same thing as Amy. It hadn't been taught in about 8 years, so it had to be pretty much completely redone, which is super exciting because you get to take it wherever you want. But there were certain weeks where I knew what I wanted to do, but I didn't know the literature well enough to be able to go, this is definitely the right reading for it. And I was trying to write this course in Korea with COVID, because it was my one chance at a holiday for the year. And I messaged Rowan and I said, I want to teach a week on this. What reading would you set? I was kind of thinking about this, and he said, yeah, that's good, but I would set this. And I went and read it and it was perfect. So yeah, echoing what Amy said, I think it's community, and it's asking for help and being honest that you don't necessarily know what you're doing, but that's all right because we're all like that.
And I would just, following up on that as well, say that it's definitely not just limited to teaching. But I think we can kind of assume that the research comes naturally, but the teaching is the hard bit. But it, for people who go into a postdoc or a research associate position or any of these things, it's still really different from the PhD. Nick.
I want to speak to that point a little bit, Rowan, because so to sort of tell my story, I'll lower my hand as well. I finished my PhD in 2017 and then had sort of 3 years or so in a very similar story to Justine, sort of piecing together teaching, sessional teaching, lucky to have intensive units in summer and winter that paid the rent and all those sorts of things. And then I was fortunate enough to get a sort of year postdoc research position. And I think I spent the first 3 or 4 months not knowing what to do with myself because I suddenly had all of this time to just sort of read and do things. And it's an absolute position of privilege, but I found it actually quite confronting after spending several years sort of squeezing in research in these gaps of in-between marking and God knows what. And I think part of it was that the PhD mindset was useful in that, you sort of go back to, well, what were the routines I'd established as a PhD student and so on. And that was useful. But at the same time, I was teaching quite a bit while I was doing my PhD as well. So it was sort of quite an interesting experience. And I'm still not sure now, this is my second year in a row of being in a sort of research only position. I still don't think I've sort of mastered it. I waste so much time in what I do. And I think that sort of that kind of seeing how other people work is very useful. So I have conversations with other people who sort of, how do you, use your time and so on, in a similar kind of position. But also mentors that there is a sense of we perhaps put the more pressure on ourselves than anyone else. Ebony, you made that point just before, that they've been quite good at telling me, it sounds like you actually are quite doing a lot of work. You be nice to yourself. You don't have to kind of, be driving yourself into the ground 9 to 5 every day of the week. That I think is part of it. And I think that is a useful takeaway for the post-PhD period, that you be, kind to yourself. You are, it's a tough time for you and everyone, but I think that we perhaps find ourselves criticize ourselves more than anyone else and so on. I think that is a useful, sort of thing to take on board. Yeah.
That's probably actually what Rowan wanted me to talk about when he mentioned that I should answer that question. I'm now realizing as Nick's talking, because that was very, very similar experience to Nick. The first, I think, 8 or 9 months of the postdoc, I was like, what? We're recording, aren't we? I can't swear. What am I doing? Like, because you feel like you've hit the jackpot, right? Because someone is paying you to research and you're like, well, I should just know what to do. And I mean, my experience with the postdoc was that my supervision was very hands-off. So the first 2 weeks, I couldn't get into the office building. I hadn't met with my supervisor because she's a very busy woman. So I was like, well, I guess I have to come up with the second project. So I spent 2 weeks madly coming up with the second project, which I still haven't done, because I then met with my supervisor and she said, okay, that's great, but we want you to write the book first from the thesis. And I was like, oh yeah, that would probably make sense, wouldn't it? So to echo what Nick said, I think it's really, really normal to have that several month period if you start a postdoc where you're going, I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing. I have all of this time and I don't quite know what I should be doing with it. Am I doing enough? And generally, I think we put more pressure on ourselves than, or 2 year period, absolutely. Do I know what I'm doing now? Probably not. Yeah. Amy, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to say on that point, which, you know, is probably going to come up maybe in the next few questions, I don't know, but I think I have found that the biggest challenge for me in making the transition from HDR to ECR, both in the postdoc that I had and now in this academic position, is it because it feels such a unicorn thing that you have achieved the thing that we have all been madly running the treadmill towards, either for a couple of years, you know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years or whatever, you've taken time away, you've come back, is the guilt and the fear that, yeah, if you're not doing it properly, or if you're not enjoying every second of it, or if you're not performing to 100% standard, then you don't deserve to be here because so many other people are missing out. Or it's, you know, all of that sort of negative self-talk that happens of, I don't really deserve to have gotten it, or, you know, there are so many other deserving people who are having such a harder time. It then makes it feel like you can't talk about what is difficult about it. And I think I felt similarly to Ebony and Nick of, in the postdoc, getting paid to research, no teaching commitments. And it was really open-ended about what my contributions to this project would be. And I was paralyzed with indecision and fear and this overwhelming pressure that it would have to be so good because you got handed this thing and the people you're working with are so incredible. So don't stuff it up and do it. So, and I just found it almost crippling. I would spend days just sitting in my office kind of doodling around and procrastinating and not being able to focus my thoughts, because if I would sit on a thought for an idea for about 5 or 10 minutes, but it didn't feel like the best idea ever, I'd be like, no, not good enough, out of here. And it took a really, really long time, probably 5 or 6 months, for me to sort of calm down and simmer. And even where I'm at now, in that I have you know, a continuing position, which is very, very lucky and a huge blessing, it's probably only, even now, I still struggle to think of the permanency of that, and that just the feeling of, I have a little bit more time to plan things. It doesn't have to be everything now, and, you know, which doesn't make me productive. It makes me less productive, because all I do is stress about it not being good enough and me not deserving it and me, you know, squandering the position. So I think it's really good to remind ourselves that, yeah, everybody else is flying by the seat of their pants, as you were saying, and that you don't have to come up with the thing immediately, that it does take time, and that it's okay to sort of not know what you're doing, and to express that a little bit, emote that out sometimes, in obviously being mindful of other people's situations, but that it's okay for you to feel what you're feeling about this opportunity, as no matter how good it is.
And I think just because we keep bouncing off each other, and this is really useful, the thing that ended up working for me was I ended up finding an article that I could work on that was new. And that was like a small enough project that I wasn't feeling exactly that crippling kind of anxiety and pressure that Amy's talking about, because it didn't have to be this big, new, huge thing that I was doing, but it was one thing that was not the thesis. It was a bit fresh, that I could work on, and that kind of got me through that. But there was still plenty of days where I was like, what am I doing here in lockdown in my apartment to a city that I've just moved to for a job that I'm not sure that I actually like, because I don't know what I should be doing. Small and manageable projects goals, absolutely. Yeah. Rowan, am I asking that next one? Yep, perfect. Okay, so I'm going to open this up to whoever. So Joy's just asked, so going right back to the beginning, this is kind of about what you wish you knew, I suppose. What things can I be doing as a first-year PhD student to help me think beyond the degree? So my supervisory team is very focused on guiding me with the thesis work and research, which is great, but I don't have much guidance for thinking about teaching, publication and conference activity, etc. So early stages, what do you think is good to be thinking forward toward?
I'm going to jump in with one thought that I wrote down on my brain dump on a piece of paper earlier today, was something about just what is the kind of like, what is your kind of little home networks and a whole lot of little sensors? Because I think some of the things that have echoed again and again so far is about the way these different communities are so valuable as sources of support, whether that's emotional or very practical support or in terms of opportunities. So is there a specific conference that you will start going to as a first year, you know, in the first year of your PhD, and go each year or go every other year whenever it's on, that becomes your kind of a kind of academic home that isn't your institution, where you meet some of these people and build those relationships over time? I think that's one thing that had been really, you know, valuable for me, is thinking about what's worth the time and the investment if you have the opportunity to attend in person funding wise. And I know there are challenges and limits with that as well, but if you can, having that one that is the fit for your project and topic, whether that's the AHA conference or something else, depending on what you're working on. I feel like that was one of the ways of building those networks that are beyond just the institution that you know, and going to all the seminars, like not all of them as a means of procrastination. I'm an excellent procrastinator. But like, you know, being present, I think, is, you know, in the networks in your institution, and then what are the networks that are outside, because those are the things that I think are really helpful to build early on, because, you know, there is that period, I don't know, probably we've all had it at the end of the PhD, where you kind of need to squirrel away and actually just get it written, and you might have to withdraw for a bit right at the end of the PhD processes to some degree to actually just get that final thesis done. I mean, I think I did. Maybe other people are better at managing their time and balancing things than I was, but I do think that for me is one of the things that's really helpful, and it's these people you might only see once every year or once every 2 years, but that's enough in an academic setting to start build those networks.
Yeah, I jump in and sort of a little bit different, and I didn't do this at all, so this is what I would sort of say to my past self a little bit. But well, firstly, I should say that hopefully I made it clear that I've ended up in a public service position. So I'm working as a researcher, but I'm not working in academia. And so I would say the other thing you can do is, obviously you might be sort of really focused on wanting to pursue that academic role. That might be the plan. You can do the networking for that, all that sort of thing. And that, I would say, also keep in mind that there are other sectors that you can work in. You know, they can be just as challenging to get into, but be open to those options, maybe be exploring those options, thinking about what an alternative career to academia might look like as well, where you might get experience in that with professional historical associations, you know, keeping an eye on what those public service roles are, for instance, looking at the GLAM sector, all those kinds of things. And I think people are probably a lot better at doing that now. I think there's more people speak about that. There, you know, at the AHA, there were a few sort of sessions where people specifically talked about those things, but I wasn't very tuned into that, possibly because I had that very, very narrow blinkered focus. So all I'd be saying is, yeah, be open to those other possibilities as well from the beginning, so you don't get to the end and just say, well, there's only one pathway, and if I'm not on it, I mustn't be doing very well.
Yeah, I really like that.
I am aware of time, and I want to make sure that we have time to kind of discuss everything. So I just want to jump in with kind of two related questions. One, picking up on something that has come up already, which is about the idea of how did you go about picking up and moving on to the infamous second project? Any further thoughts on that? But related to that was a pre-circulated question about how do you keep the research part of ECR life going when you're busy working and all these other kinds of things, where it's often full-time work, whether that's, you know, sessional teaching and stuff like that, whether it's outside of academia, whether it's like history adjacent work, any of those kinds of things. What advice would you give to ECRs who want to do the book proposal, want to do the book, want to start the second project, kind of want to keep that research part of their identity kind of going when they are working full-time or close to full-time in some other kind of position?
I can go. I'll given that I brought up the sort of second project sort of point before, I feel like I probably should, and my examiners were very helpful. I'll always remember sort of about a year after I'd submit, maybe less actually, having a coffee and lunch with one of my examiners, and he asked that question. He was like, well, what's next? And I said, well, here's the sort of long list, the 10 things that I think I would like to work on, you know, that kind of come out of it. And he, you know, pulled his face at a couple of them. And so, you know, mentally I strike those ones off, but also sort of said, you actually have kind of 1 or 2 ideas in these 10 that sort of work together in a way. You don't have 10 ideas, you have 2 or 3. And so that then kind of became the sort of, you know, the foundation for which then became, you know, my now DECRA project, which is what I'm sort of now working on. And you know, that's 6 years later. So there's a long gap in between there. That being said, there were other little in between. I mean, Ebony, you mentioned the sort of article project that you sort of bridging the gap between what, you know, was the next big project and the kind of old PhD project. There was still little hanging parts from the PhD that were there that kind of would tide me over, if you will, before I had the time to really get stuck into the next project. So I think talking like it's a similar conversation to what you have when you begin a PhD. You know, here are the things I'm thinking of working on, to people who, you know are knowledgeable about these things, and sort of say, well, I think this sounds like a feasible kind of project. That was really useful advice that then, you know, stood me well in the next, you know, however long it was. But then your other question about how you maintain that research sort of profile, if you will, and you know, as stark as it sounds, it meant working on sort of weekends and late at night and things like that, that there is a kind of internal motivation you sort of need to, or that I needed to sort of hold on to be like, well, I could just teach and then not publish articles and what have you. But, you know, I did sort of map out a plan, and it did require me to stay research active, as much as that term is a bit nauseating. But I just sort of had to find little bits and pieces of time in between the jobs that made me actual money that kind of were part of it. And I think you learn, it took me trial and error to work out, you know, can I read over the weekend or something, or can I write at a time when I was not normally comfortable with writing? That would be after work, where I'm a sort of get it out of the way in the morning sort of person. But I think that trial and error of what works for you, and everyone's probably going to have a different answer for that question, was how I got through. It was just sort of, dare I say, gritting my teeth and kind of being really tired all the time. But yeah, I think that's my sort of slightly depressing answer to that question, I suppose. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to build on some of Nick's points on a really practical level, because I think it's really important to, there's a difference, I think, when you're sort of working in academia versus not, because one of the things that I really underestimated when I thought I'm going to take this full-time job that is not in academia was that I lost all that connection to the university, which meant losing. And the biggest issue, apart from the lack of time, and I really struggle with figuring out how to get stuff done when you're also working full time, when you fit that in. I took some annual leave sometime and I went down to 0.9, so I had half a day theoretically to write. I don't think I used it very well, but the biggest thing aside from that was actually.
Oh no. Okay. It wouldn't be a Zoom seminar without some.
Have I frozen?
Oh, you're back.
I'm back. Yay for the University of Waikato's internet network that apparently has just been upgraded. Yeah, but yeah, so the biggest thing was the lack of that access to all of those library and university resources, and I underestimated how much that was. It's not that you can't get them, but if you always have to like find illegal copies or ask people to send you a download of an article that you think you need and you're not really sure because you haven't been able to look at it properly, like that was a big issue to be aware of. Download everything before you leave if you are going to be in that situation. And the one other thing I think was writing collaboratively is the only thing that really kept me writing at that time, was that I had things that I was writing with other people and I was accountable to them. So they were doing part of the work, but also I was accountable to someone that wasn't myself to get something done. And that was, I think, really the thing that helped me keep writing something during those times. So I've got lots more thoughts, but I would just leave it on those 2 points for now.
Really, really good points, Kate. And just to very briefly add to that, squirreling away some archival sources, stuff that you find during your PhD that doesn't fit, but you can do something with it. So you've got the files, and when you don't have the resources to be able to make the trip to the archive, you've got the scan there and you can work on it without the resourcing. Yeah, in fact, I think that was a Rowan hot tip, which are coming out all over the place.
And also apply for the things that have funding. Apply the conferences, workshops, often smaller ones that fully fund the selected participants. That's the way I got to, that's the only conferences or workshops I did while I was not in academia. Were none of these big ones. It wasn't at the AHA, it wasn't at that. I was post-PhD, so I'm not getting the graduate student funding or anything. It was ones like that that allow you to kind of still connect or share your work. So all of these things you kind of have to look at differently if you're not connected to a university. Or maybe even if you are, but you're in an insecure temporary role.
Yeah, just jump in there and say with the whole share the library login details, people from different institutions. You're so many different people have done that for me, and I've done it for others as well. And that kept me going at points when I was locked out from various sort of from being able to access resources. So that's an important one. Very, very helpful. The other sort of point I wanted to circle back to, I think, was Nick's about learning to work in ways that you don't like. Like I like to work in the mornings. I like to work for several hours really steadily. I get it done. That's how I work. I couldn't work like that at various times. And of all people, the advice, I heard Annabelle Crabb talking about how she was writing a book while she had a baby. I don't know, she was doing a million things, whatever. And she said, just do 10 minutes where you can. And I'd never worked like that. And I thought it was impossible and I didn't want to do it. But when I was working in my sort of non-academic roles for quite some time, if I could take 10 minutes at lunch, or I don't know, the manager was out of the room, whatever, I could sneak in literally sometimes 5-10 minutes to think a thought, jot something down, read a bit of an article. And I actually ended up publishing things that way. I was surprised that it worked. And it actually sort of informed how I work now, because I think I had to learn how to hold a lot of this stuff. I don't know, like just get something down. I was very precious during the PhD, maybe because I had time, like it had to be good. It had to be a certain standard. Being too busy, not having enough time has just made me go, that's on the page. I can work with that. There's something there. So, that can be useful as well. I'd also just say quickly, do as much as you can do. Don't compare with others. Really, really hard. I think it's something we all do. So I haven't written the book manuscript yet. Who knows if I will. I didn't apply for DECRAs. It didn't work for me. What I did do was publish chapters and articles when and where I could as well. It was more manageable with the teaching load. It was more manageable with the kinds of jobs that I was doing. And then I was simultaneously applying for those jobs outside of the university sector as well. And I was talking up what I had done. So, that's another point that I think I'd raise. It's about what you can do, not what others around you are doing.
And I think because of the pipeline that Kate was talking about earlier, it always feels like everyone else is doing more than you are. And that's often not the case. Yeah, that was a really big learning curve for me as well, was not comparing my output to what it seemed like everyone else was doing around me.
Yeah. And I wanted to ask, just kind of build on those last points, because I think I had a question for myself when I was not working in academia and I wasn't sure whether I was going back to it, which was like, what are the things that I actually want to publish and put out before I go, okay, I'm kind of done with this and I'm moving on with my career in these other directions. And at that time, it was like, no, actually, the book is not going to be one of those things at that point in time. Now, when I came back into the job I'm in now, I was like, okay, yeah, I do need to do that and get that done. But at that time, it was like, actually, this isn't the priority. This isn't what I want to work on. What am I motivated to work on? What are the things that I really want to be and can feasibly get done at that time? And I think that was important, to prioritize what's important to you and what you feel is a valuable contribution that you can make in the circumstances that you are working in. And I think that was, helpful to free from some of the kind of institutional expectations that we may have somewhat ingrained in ourselves from those messaging that we get when we're in a PhD or in an academic setting.
I think that's, super relevant and important point, all of them really, but I definitely had the same thing as Kate in that I still haven't written the book that I said that I'm not quitting until I've done this book. It's not the PhD book. It was, I'm happy to quit and not do the PhD book but there's this other project that I do want to write, and that's what I'm doing, and I'll find a way to do that no matter what. We've got the question without notice, and now, as far as I know, Nick is the only person here that can answer this. So I am going to dump him in it before I know he has to go very soon.
It's perfect timing. Yes, I'll happily jump in. Yes, my daughter was born in May of 2020, which was a wild time in a variety of different ways to have a child. But I actually found that having my daughter, Chloe is my daughter's name, having her helped put a lot of things into perspective. Suddenly that article actually didn't matter as much as whether or not I got to, spend the weekend with my daughter. And I think that actually has been helpful in that way, whether it's made me more productive or not. Well, actually, it's made me far less productive. I'll be sort of completely open and upfront with that. But I think that I was sort of fortunate. Well, I am fortunate. I have a very understanding wife who, she's not academically, she runs her own business. It's not at all related to academia or anything like that. But over the course of doing a PhD and the first couple of years, so like I said, I finished in 2017, but my daughter was born in 2020. Those first 2 or 3 years post-PhD, she was sort of supportive, but also very understanding of the kind of the weirdness that is academic precarity, the kind of those sort of things. And so we'd already sort of navigated, well, this is how our time is going to be used. And so then looking after Chloe and being parents was just, let's plug that into the existing kind of, compromises that we have to make over the course. And I think that's what it is. It's about finding, being lucky enough to have a supportive partner, but then being, supported back. Sort of recognizing that, yes, there are more important things than whether or not people know more about, Australian developmental policy after the Second World War. And it is my now 3-year-old daughter. And I think that's how I've sort of worked through it. But I suspect there might be people with different sort of attitudes towards that sort of thing as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Nick. I'm glad we had you. I can talk about what it's like to support 2 cats while you're in ECR, but I don't know that that's particularly helpful. Well, we're approaching 3:30, so I might do a bit of a final call for questions, thoughts before we start to wrap.
Ebony, are we gonna, that last question that you said about like the sort of what you wish you'd known?
Yes, great point. Thank you. Sorry, I'm just
I
looking.
would have just one thing I'd like to say to that potentially.
Yes, please. There's a more specific question here, but we might hold that and even get some opinions and send them through. Does that sound all right, Rowan? Yeah. Okay, just so that we don't hold everyone too long. Thank you, Nick. Yes, okay, well, we'll run with that then. Sorry, we're just, in true ECR fashion, we're running with chaos. Okay, so what do you wish you'd known when you finished your PhD / do you have any advice for people navigating that transition?
So seeing as I asked you to ask a question, I'll just jump in because I just have one point that I kind of wish I'd done more of and I think would be really valuable. Is like we've sort of talked about all these tough things, it's difficult, it's uncertain. And one of the things that I think is really important is to like celebrate all the milestones that you do achieve along the way, and that like starts with like, maybe you've got your full draft and you want to mark that and you submit and you have your viva. I don't know if all the institutions in Australia do the oral defense or viva or not, but certainly I had to do that. And then I didn't find out for some months what my examiner's comments were till after that. And then, actually graduating and all of those things or submitting a paper, whatever it is, it feels like it's very easy to kind of constantly focus on the next thing you have to do and the uncertainty that you're in, or the idea you should be doing more. All of these things we've kind of talked about. But a friend said to me, she didn't understand why we don't celebrate graduations as much as we do like weddings or these big milestone birthdays me might have, because it's such an important achievement and so much work's gone on to it. And it was kind of like, yeah, that's a point. Like, if we don't kind of do it ourselves and make a thing of it, more of a kind of moment of actually we have done all of these
amazing, you know, hard work and got to a certain point, then I think it's easier to just kind of keep rolling on. And so that was my kind of one thing. And all of those things, if someone sends you an email about, hey, they've used your work or you've helped them in some way, like I have a good email tab to put those things in. So you have a place, if you're struggling, you can see all of these nice things and these good things that people might have been in contact with you about and said, you know, thanks, Ron, for taking me for that dinner to help me plan that course or whatever. And you're like, cool, hey, actually, there is this network. And that was one thing I kind of wish I'd done more of. And I think it would be lovely to kind of continue to build a culture of kind of celebration and connection that can be easy to forget when we're busy and stressed. Yeah, I really like that. And particularly that, you know, send people emails to tell them that you read that thing they wrote and you liked it, or you're using their article, or because that is the kind of stuff that adds up to mean a lot when you're having the rough days, big time. Yeah. Anyone else want to final words of advice before we close? I think that's a pretty good note to end on, if not anyway. Well, thank you all for coming. It's been wonderful to hang out with you all. We will be back next year with more seminars on what theme, who knows. Rowan and I will come up with something and you'll see an email from us next year. But thank you, Kate and Justine. Thank you, Amy, Nick, who's now gone. Appreciate you all coming today.
Hi, everyone. Thank you.